On the evening of October 14th, 2004, in the town of Wren's Hollow, visibility along Bramble Road had dropped to under 30 feet. Fog clung low to the pavement, thick enough to mute the trees and make the power lines vanish into white. That stretch of road, twisting past rust-colored maples and a narrow creek bed, had never been a place people lingered. Locals passed through with headlights on, eyes forward. But that evening, one car pulled over and never moved again. Lana Merritt had stopped earlier at a gas station just north of the county line. The cashier remembered her, a short woman in a navy hoodie, carrying a small boy wrapped in a dinosaur print blanket. She paid in cash, asked where the nearest payphone was, then bought apple juice, a granola bar, and a single pack of tissues. Security footage showed her leaving the store with Jacob in her arms around 6:12 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them. Her car, a green Ford Taurus, was discovered the next morning at 6:47 a.m. by a delivery driver heading east. It sat half on the shoulder, half nosed into the weeds. The driver's side door was ajar, the engine cold, headlights still faintly beaming. The hazard lights weren't on. The keys were missing. Inside, Lana's purse was still on the passenger seat. Her cell phone, a clunky flip model, sat dead between the seats, its back panel removed. A juice box, half drunk, had rolled under the back seat, and Jacob's car seat was still buckled, empty. What stood out to responders wasn't just the car or the fact that it looked untouched. It was the stillness. No broken glass, no drag marks, no disturbed brush, nothing to suggest a struggle. If someone had been taken, it wouldn't have been violent. If someone had left, it wasn't in a panic. There were no tire tracks leading away, just the ones Lana had left behind when she pulled over. Deputies marked the scene off with yellow tape, but few believed there would be much to find. The entire area smelled of wet pine and river mud, and the overnight fog had left everything slick with dew. By the time the search dogs were brought in, any scent would have been washed into the grass or lost in the flowing creek nearby. Family members were contacted. Lana's sister, Emily, said Lana had been on her way to drop Jacob off before a court meeting the next morning. She'd sounded tired on the phone, but not frightened. She didn't say she was stopping. She didn't mention car trouble. Jacob had been excited about preschool the next day. There had been no warning signs, no distress messages, nothing. Locals began speculating within hours. Some were quick to suggest abduction. Bramble Road, after all, was isolated, with long gaps between houses and more woods than pavement. A few people remembered a string of break-ins from the early 90s, a man who had stalked cars at dusk, but those cases were never solved and had faded from public memory. Others wondered if Lana had staged her own disappearance. She and Jacob's father were recently separated, and court battles over custody had become heated. But even those who believed she may have run couldn't explain the open car door, the missing keys, or why she'd leave behind her purse, her phone, and her son's favorite blanket. For the first time in more than a decade, Wren's Hollow faced a case that had no precedent, no body, no note, no indication of whether this was a crime or a choice. Flyers went up. Search teams combed the area for a full week, using drones, thermal scans, even cadaver dogs. Nothing, not a shred of clothing, not a shoe, not a broken branch that told them where to look next. Volunteers drifted away. The road reopened, and the town quietly held its breath. Bramble Road became a name people avoided speaking out loud. Mothers stopped driving it after sunset. Joggers took alternate trails. Mail carriers kept windows up. Lana's family held vigils in silence, praying someone would come forward. But by winter, the flyers had yellowed in the rain, and Lana and Jacob's faces had started to fade beneath the plastic tape holding them to utility poles. By spring, the county marked the case as a suspicious disappearance. The sheriff's office said they were still pursuing leads, but behind closed doors, investigators admitted they had nothing. It was as if the fog had swallowed them whole, and whatever happened in the space between the headlights and the creek bed had left no trace. Only silence, and a car door swinging gently in the cold October wind. Deputies arrived at the car before sunrise. The Ford Taurus sat at an awkward angle, its front right tire half sunk into the soft shoulder, but otherwise intact. The headlights had dimmed but still cast a faint glow against the wet brush. Inside, nothing was broken. No shattered glass, no smeared blood. The driver's seat was adjusted forward, keys still missing, and the parking brake engaged. Lana's purse remained untouched on the passenger side, zipped, her wallet inside, cash still folded, the makeup bag still snapped shut. A gas receipt from the station time-stamped just after 6. Jacob's car seat was buckled tight in the rear, empty. A juice box had tipped over and dried sticky on the seat. 2 crayon drawings lay face up beside it, one of a house with 3 stick figures, the other of a dinosaur holding a balloon. Jacob had signed both in shaky red letters, J.M. There were no skid marks behind the car, no broken twigs or disturbed grass leading away. Rain had passed through during the early morning hours, just enough to smooth the soil, just enough to wash away light tracks. The few prints deputies could locate were partial, smeared by runoff or trampled by responders. The closest matched Lana's tread. The rest couldn't be confirmed. The area around the car had a stillness that felt staged, as if it had been cleaned, but nothing had been taken. A search perimeter was established by noon. Volunteers, deputies, and cadaver dogs fanned out in slow-moving lines through the woods and creek bed on both sides of Bramble Road. Dogs initially picked up a scent heading east toward the Bellman Creek Bridge, a half-mile down a gravel incline. It wasn't a direction the road would have led her naturally. It was off the main route, past where mail trucks turned around and power company trucks parked to check lines. But Lana had no reason to be heading that way. She wasn't from that part of the county, and the fog that night had made visibility so low that few would have wandered off on foot unless they were being led or forced. The dogs lost the scent on the wooden slats halfway across the bridge. Below was shallow water, rocky, just a few feet deep with thin branches tangled beneath. Divers were brought in anyway, but nothing surfaced. No footprints, no fibers, no broken wood. Just silence. The theory began to shift. Investigators started to believe this hadn't been a random roadside emergency, that someone had either staged the car to look that way or had taken advantage of it the moment she pulled over. There were no immediate suspects. No witnesses had come forward. Surveillance footage from the gas station confirmed she had left alone. She wasn't followed. No suspicious vehicles were reported along Bramble Road that night. But then again, there were barely any vehicles at all. It was a dead stretch, lined with nothing but trees and rusted fencing for almost 4 miles. Anyone could have been watching from the dark without being seen. Detectives began cross-referencing parole records, sex offender registries, prior domestic disputes. Lana's ex-husband, Mark Merritt, was interviewed within 24 hours. He was cold, cooperative, and distant. Claimed he hadn't spoken to Lana in nearly a week. Said she never showed up to drop off Jacob. His alibi checked out. He was seen working overnight shifts at a steel yard nearly 20 miles away. Other family members were questioned. No one could make sense of it. Lana wasn't suicidal. She wasn't known to take unnecessary detours. She had a clean record, a job at a local bakery, and was preparing for a custody hearing the following week. There was no known stalker, no threats, no ex-boyfriend in the shadows, just fog and a car and a vanished mother and child. At a press conference held 3 days later, the sheriff admitted they were struggling. The word abduction was used carefully, not confirmed, not ruled out. The term voluntary disappearance was also floated, a softer version of running away. But no one close to Lana believed she would have done that, especially not without taking essentials. Her toothbrush, her son's medication, her family photos, all left behind. The bridge became a fixation. Local kids had always believed it was haunted. Some said a girl had drowned 3 years back. Others said strange things happened near it, missing cats, strange carvings in the trees, shoes found tied together and hanging from branches. But none of that led to answers, just rumors. Deputies swept the area again the following week. Scent dogs failed to react. They'd been thrown off by the storm, the cold, the too late search. Evidence, if it ever existed, had been erased. What no one could explain was the lack of drag marks, the absence of a second set of tire treads. If a stranger had abducted them, how had they done so without leaving a single clear print? If Lana had walked away, why hadn't she taken Jacob's shoes or her own phone? If she was running, why take the bridge? As days passed, theories piled up. Maybe a passing driver had lured them. Maybe someone had parked deep in the woods, just out of view. Maybe Lana had trusted the wrong person. Maybe she knew them. The town tried to keep the posters up, but rain tore most of them loose by the end of the month. The flyers curled, blurred, and scattered. For Wren's Hollow, it wasn't just a disappearance, it was a crack in the illusion of safety. People stopped pulling over for strangers. They kept their children closer. And they began to look at Bramble Road not just as a road with a shoulder, but as a place where something had happened, something that left no trace, no sound, and no warning. Just an open car door, and a bridge that seemed to lead nowhere. In the early days of the investigation, one name kept surfacing: Mark Merritt, Lana's estranged husband and Jacob's father. They'd separated 6 months before the disappearance, and the split had not been amicable. Court records showed a pending custody battle, joint property disputes, and multiple filings for visitation rights. Mark had been living in a rented duplex across town. His pickup wasn't parked out front the night Lana vanished, which, to some, felt like the first bad sign. Detectives brought him in for questioning within 36 hours. He didn't flinch. Said he'd been working an overnight shift at the Jameson Steel plant from 6:00 p.m. to 4 a.m. He gave names. Shift logs matched. Security footage showed him entering the facility on time. He never left. The alibi held. But it wasn't his location that raised concern. It was his effect. He didn't ask for case updates, didn't press for details about the search. According to one detective, he barely mentioned his son by name. Mark's background was quietly reviewed. His juvenile record was sealed, but unofficial sources recalled early incidents: a knife pulled during a fight in high school, and a restraining order filed by an old girlfriend. In 1997, Lana herself had filed a temporary protective order after a physical altercation in their kitchen. She dropped it 2 weeks later. Friends said he had a temper, especially when drinking. Former co-workers described him as solitary, moody, prone to silence. One mentioned he used to drive past Lana's house after their separation, headlights off. None of that was enough to press charges. Mark agreed to a polygraph. The results came back inconclusive. Not failed, just unreadable. Investigators noted he answered every question with the same flat tone. Asked if he'd seen Lana the week she disappeared, he said no. Asked if he knew where Jacob was, he blinked and said he wished he did. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He didn't say much at all. Public opinion was not as cautious. In Wren's Hollow, suspicion tends to stick even without proof. Rumors traveled fast, that he'd followed her from the gas station, that he'd hidden a spare key to her car, that he'd worked construction near Bellman Creek in the past and knew the bridge better than most. People pointed to the divorce papers, the custody fight, the fact that Lana was preparing to move counties with Jacob once the hearing finalized. The timeline matched. The motive was plausible, but the evidence was missing. His co-workers backed him, said he clocked in on time, wore his safety vest, and ran the same line he always did. The shift manager confirmed it. Security logs aligned with his story. Still, when the first news reports aired, mother and son missing, car found on Bramble Road, his name hovered like smoke. He gave a short statement to the police, none to the press, never joined the search parties, didn't show up to the vigils. When asked again a month later if he had anything to do with it, Mark didn't deny the possibility. He said sometimes he wondered if maybe he had driven her away, if maybe she'd run because of him, but he insisted he hadn't touched her. Not that night, not in years. Detectives kept him on their internal radar, but without evidence, they had nowhere to go. By the end of that year, the media moved on. There were newer stories, louder tragedies, fresher leads elsewhere. Flyers were taken down, search efforts thinned, and Mark returned to work in silence. Still living alone, still saying nothing. His name faded from headlines, but not from whispers. When he walked into stores, people turned. When he sat at the bar, no one took the stool beside him. Inside the Merritt family, silence spread like rot. Lana's parents stopped speaking to him entirely. Her sister once spotted him outside Jacob's old preschool and threatened to call the police. He denied it, said he was just passing by, said he didn't even realize where he was. But no one believed him. Behind closed doors, the family fractured. Holidays passed with one empty chair. Jacob's room remained untouched. Lana's voicemail password was never cracked. Her phone had never received another call after the night she vanished. The house grew quieter. The investigation slowed. Mark's name stayed penciled in the margins of police reports, not confirmed, not cleared, just waiting. And though time dulled the urgency, it never fully erased the suspicion. Because in a town like Wren's Hollow, when someone disappears and the spouse doesn't scream, doesn't search, doesn't cry on television, people don't forget. And investigators don't stop watching, not really. Not even after the case goes quiet. In the fall of 2006, 2 years after Lana and Jacob Merritt vanished without a sound, a groundskeeper named Donald Briggs was clearing brush behind an abandoned farmhouse off Briar Patch Road. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded and porch sunken, surrounded by tall grass and rotting farm tools. Donald was tasked with cleaning up overgrowth before the county auctioned the land. He didn't expect to find anything unusual, but wedged beneath the roots of a fallen fence post, he spotted the faded corner of what looked like nylon, red with frayed stitching and a half-torn zipper. He pulled it loose from the soil and realized it was a child's backpack. It was small, stained, and water-damaged, probably there for a long time. Inside, he found 2 crumpled drawings folded into each other. One was of a blue house with a sun drawn too big in the sky. The other showed a stick figure holding the hand of a dinosaur. In the bottom corner, written in shaky red marker, was the name Jake M. Also inside, a green plastic triceratops scratched with a pocket knife, the letters JM faint but visible on the underside. Donald didn't make the connection right away, but when he brought the backpack to the sheriff's office, a deputy recognized the initials before he even opened the flap. The bag was sent to a lab. Dirt samples were pulled from the inner lining. DNA swabs were taken from the shoulder straps. The match was confirmed within a week. The backpack belonged to Jacob Merritt, but it had been found nearly 12 miles from where he and his mother were last seen. And that changed everything. Detectives immediately reopened the file. For 2 years, the case had been cold. No new leads, no movement. But now this backpack, this quiet object buried in the dirt, raised questions no one had been prepared to face. If Jacob's belongings ended up near Briar Patch Road, how had they gotten there? Who brought them? And more hauntingly, had Jacob still been alive when he did? The farmhouse, near where the backpack was found, had once belonged to the Prindle family, but they'd abandoned it in the late 90s. Since then, it has become a known squatter site. County records showed at least 3 trespassing reports from the previous decade. One of those reports, from early 2005, included a name investigators remembered, Floyd Riggins. A former trucker turned drifter, Riggins had a long history of trespassing, indecent exposure, and 1 count of unlawful restraint in 1998 that had been pled down. He'd spent time in county lockup, then vanished off the grid. No permanent address, no relatives. His last known residence had been a rusted RV parked 3 miles from the Prindle property. Detectives pulled his file and began tracking old reports. Witnesses described him as quiet, erratic, obsessed with maps and old newspaper clippings. One claimed he used to mention things about watching the creek and the little ones, but none of it was enough to arrest. And by the time they tried to locate him, the trail had gone cold again. Riggins hadn't been seen in over a year. Crime scene techs searched the perimeter where the backpack was found. They brought in cadaver dogs, but the soil had been disrupted by erosion and flooding from the previous winter. Nothing surfaced, no bones, no clothing. Just dirt, stone, and silence. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the implication. Someone had Jacob's belongings long after the night he vanished, and they had moved them. The press caught wind quickly. Local papers ran headlines. Backpack mystery reignites cold case. Rumors spread that Jacob had been seen riding a bike near a trailer park in 2005. Another woman claimed she heard a child crying in the woods behind her property the same summer. None of it could be verified. Tips came in, but they led nowhere. The dinosaur toy was bagged, photographed, stored, but not even that could point to who had held it last. For Lana's family, the discovery shattered any fragile hope they'd been holding on to. The idea that Jacob might have lived, even for a few days, weeks, months, reopened grief in a way that felt crueler than before. Had he been kept somewhere? Had he called out for her? Had she heard him? Detectives mapped out the possible routes between Bramble Road and Briar Patch. A handful of logging roads crisscrossed the hills between them, all secluded, all quiet. It was possible someone had moved between the two sites without ever passing through town, someone familiar with the terrain, someone who knew which parts of the county stayed unlit and unpatrolled, someone who didn't want to be seen. But without a witness, a confession, or new forensic evidence, the case once again stalled. The backpack was real. The drawings were real. But the person who left them behind had vanished, just like Lana and Jacob. The sheriff's department made a public plea for anyone who had seen activity near the old farmhouse in the spring of 2005. A few calls came in, none panned out, and so the bag was archived. Its contents are preserved, but no one could shake the feeling that it had been left there on purpose, not lost, not dropped, placed, as if someone wanted it to be found, or worse, had no more use for it. By 2010, 6 years after Lana and Jacob Merritt vanished without a trace, the case had all but flatlined. The backpack discovery had sparked renewed attention 4 years earlier, but nothing came of it. Detectives had quietly cycled through the same stack of names, ex-husband, family, past offenders, repeating questions that never led anywhere. But then, in the early spring of that year, a tip came through the sheriff's voicemail. No name, no callback number, just a message from a voice that sounded older, maybe shaken, telling them to look in the woods behind Sycamore Valley. Check the RV, he's got clippings. That was all it said. Sycamore Valley sat just beyond county lines, miles of pine and dust with no real homes, just hunting shacks, old trailers, and the occasional generator humming behind tin walls. Deputies responded that same afternoon, pushing their way down an overgrown path until they reached the clearing. A rusted Class C motorhome stood crooked on a slope, its tires long, flat, windows covered in cardboard. The land wasn't owned by anyone. No power, no plumbing. Just the RV and a dented steel barrel outside filled with ash and scorched foil. Inside, the air was heavy. Cigarette smoke, mildew, and something older. The man who opened the door was thin, pale, and barefoot. Floyd Riggins, 61 years old, dishonorably discharged in 1987, 3 arrests for trespassing, 1 for assault. His name had briefly surfaced in connection to the Briar Patch property years ago, but was never formally pursued. That has changed now. Riggins didn't protest the visit. He said almost nothing at all. Deputies asked if he'd had any visitors recently. He shook his head. When asked if he lived alone, he nodded. Then he turned his back and sat on a threadbare cot like the conversation was over. They didn't have a warrant, but what they saw from the threshold was enough to raise questions. Dozens of newspaper clippings were pinned to a corkboard above the sink. Most were yellowed, curling at the edges. Headlines from all over the state. Missing girl, 9, last seen at fairgrounds. Mother vanishes after church social. Toddler disappears from backyard. Then, there it was. Lana Merritt's face, scanned from a 2004 article. Her picture had been circled in red ink, twice. They asked Riggins why he kept it. He shrugged, said he followed cases, that he liked to keep track of the ones they never solve. One deputy glanced down and noticed a plastic triceratops on the floor near the heater vent. But when they asked about it, Riggins said it was his nephew's, said it had been there for years, said it meant nothing. They couldn't search further, not legally, not without a warrant or probable cause. No signs of blood, no bones, no weapons, just paper and vague associations. But the presence of Lana's photo, the circled ink, the dinosaur, and the proximity to the location where Jacob's backpack had turned up, it felt like more than coincidence. Still, it wasn't enough to hold him. They returned 3 days later with a warrant, but by then, it was too late. Riggins was found dead inside the RV. Natural causes, a stroke. The coroner estimated he'd passed during the night. No signs of foul play, no suicide note. Just his body, his clutter, and his clippings. Deputies searched every inch of the RV. They lifted the carpets, pulled up the vent grates, dug shallow pits outside. They found bones, but they belonged to animals. No human remains. The plastic dinosaur was bagged, photographed, and sent for testing, but no DNA was recovered. Detectives found a small notebook near his cot, filled with odd phrases and fragmented thoughts. Bellman Bridge, wrong turn again, Mama crying in the fog, but no clear admissions, no names, no directions. Whether the phrases were memories, fantasies, or delusions, no one could say. Riggins's family, few as they were, denied any knowledge of his interest in the disappearance. One niece described him as quiet but strange, said he once asked her where kids go when they vanish and if the woods remember faces. But again, strange wasn't illegal. And with his death, so died the only person who might have had answers. The news ran a brief story. Local man found dead in RV. Ties to cold case speculated. But there was nothing to prosecute, no one to question, no more trail to follow. The name Floyd Riggins became another shadow in a story already crowded with silence. Some believed he was responsible. Others thought he was just a man obsessed with things he couldn't explain. Either way, his grave was unmarked, his remains unclaimed. For Lana's sister, the discovery was devastating. To have a name, a face, and still no resolution, it only deepened the wound. Because if he had done something, no justice would come. And if he hadn't, the real answer was still out there. In town, whispers spread that Riggins had bragged to someone once, maybe a drifter, maybe no one real, that he knew what the creek kept, that he liked the bridge because it swallowed sound. No one could confirm it, but after that, people started avoiding Sycamore Valley entirely. And for detectives, the case once again settled into that familiar coldness. A suspect is dead. A clue with no follow-up. A line that led into the woods and then stopped. Just like everything else in this story. Just like Lana. Just like Jacob. Gone. Without a trace. By the time 2021 arrived, the disappearance of Lana and Jacob Merritt had become one of those stories that people only talked about in past tense. Most of Wren's Hollow had moved on. A few officers who'd worked the original case had retired or transferred. Lana's parents had passed quietly, their obituary making no mention of closure. The missing posters had long since weathered off the poles, and the files, what was left of them, were in a banker's box marked Merritt Case Unresolved. Officially, the trail was cold. But what brought it back to life wasn't evidence. It was a whisper from a neighboring town, from a woman no one had connected to the Merritts before. Rachel Kiernan lived in Calverton, 15 miles east. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, but in June of that year she left a message on the sheriff's non-emergency line. Her voice was even, but her words were specific. She said her father, Francis Kiernan, had confessed something in the last few months of his life, something he had said dozens of times before, but that she never took seriously until recently. He had told her he saw something the night Lana and Jacob disappeared, something at the bridge. Rachel's father had suffered from dementia in his final years. He was known to ramble, and by most accounts he had been drunk more often than not. The original investigators had dismissed him when he came forward in late 2004. He'd shown up at the station on foot, reeking of alcohol, muttering about someone throwing something off the bridge. Deputies took his statement, but without corroborating details, it was chalked up to confusion. There was no follow-up, no formal report, just a scribbled note in the margins of the case file. F. Kiernan, unreliable witness. But Rachel said she found something after her father died. While sorting through his belongings, she opened a rusted metal lunchbox hidden beneath a false floorboard in the shed behind their house. Inside were several folded drawings, faded, water-stained, stuck together at the corners. One showed a stick figure in a red shirt standing on a bridge. Another had a scribbled name in the corner, Jacob M. There was also a newspaper clipping from 2004 with Lana's face, circled faintly in pencil, and a grocery receipt dated October 13th, the day before they vanished. The lunchbox was brought to the county sheriff's office. The drawings were sent to a forensic lab, where analysts confirmed that the paper stock and crayons matched what was available in 2004. The handwriting appeared consistent with the previously recovered Jake M. signatures, and the receipt placed someone from Rachel's household in Wren's Hollow within 24 hours of the disappearance, something her father never mentioned. It was enough to reopen the file. Investigators revisited the Bellman Creek Bridge. the same bridge the scent dogs had pulled toward 17 years earlier. At the time, the dogs lost the trail mid-span. No one found anything, but no one had searched beneath it with the technology available now. The bridge had deteriorated significantly. Weeds grew through the asphalt. Wood planks were split from years of rot and neglect. It had been decommissioned in 2015 after flood damage, but was never dismantled. Just left to lean, abandoned, over the shallow creek bed. This time, authorities brought in ground-penetrating radar. The equipment could scan through dense clay and silt, mapping voids and disruptions below the surface. The operator began on the south side, near the concrete base. For hours, the screen showed only soil, root webs, and natural riverbed scatter. Then, just beneath a ridge of stone about 8 feet from the bank, a shape appeared. Elongated, roughly human-sized. Then another, smaller. Both aligned side by side, as if placed. The area was immediately cordoned off. Search crews brought in shovels and portable lighting. Forensics waited on standby. The soil was fragile and slick with algae. But beneath layers of sediment and time, something was there. Bits of decayed fabric, a corroded metal clasp, a tangle of what looked like hair caught in tree root clusters. Then, finally, bone, small, porous, a child's radius cracked at the midpoint. It was no longer a missing persons case. For weeks, authorities said nothing publicly. They needed confirmation. DNA from the bone was tested. It came back as a direct match to Jacob Merritt. The second set of remains, larger, more degraded, carried dental work that matched Lana's dental records from 2003. Forensics found traces of nylon cord embedded in the surrounding soil, a rusted bracelet buried inches away, and deep between two stones, a locket. Inside, a black and white photo of a woman holding a baby on her hip. Lana and Jacob. The location of the remains stunned investigators. They had been within 100 yards of where the car was found. The dogs had nearly reached them in 2004. But the rain that night, the limitations of early scent tracking, and the precise placement had masked everything. The silt had built up, layering over the shallow bank, concealing them in plain sight. For 17 years. Detectives began combing records again, not just for suspects, but for those who knew the bridge, who worked near it, who might have known how to move quietly in and out without being seen. Someone had put them there. Someone who never meant for them to be found, but now they were. And someone, somewhere, had to know why. The heat came early that summer. By mid-June of 2025, the Bellman Creek bed had dried to a trickle. Cracks split across the banks. Dust clung to the undersides of willow leaves, and the smell of algae hung thick in the air. For the first time in nearly a decade, crews were able to get below the bridge without wading through waist-high water. That's when the excavation began. The equipment was quiet, methodical. Ground-penetrating radar had already marked the spot, an anomaly just beneath the silt, near the old south support beam where runoff had collected for years. By the second day, teams brought in by the state's cold case division began digging by hand. They weren't expecting what they found so quickly. Roughly 21 inches below the surface, the first bone surfaced, thin, curved, porous. Not an animal. A radius, later confirmed to be from a child under the age of 10. 8 inches away, lodged between two broken stones entangled in decomposed fabric, was a partial mandible. A forensic odontologist would later confirm the fillings matched Lana Merritt's dental records from 2003. She had a small chip on her left second molar, visible in the X-rays. The same chip was found in the bone retrieved from the soil. Word spread quietly at first. The sheriff's office made no public statement. They didn't have to. News crews arrived within a day, drawn by the tape, the digging, the quiet faces of men and women in gloves and masks. The public didn't need details. They already knew. For nearly 2 decades, Bellman Creek had been a place of silence and dread. Now the silence had split wide open. The soil around the bones told its own story. It was compacted unnaturally, suggesting deliberate placement. Layers of sediment above were untouched. No flood had unearthed this. No animal had disturbed it. Someone had buried them here carefully, not deep, but precise, just below visibility, just far enough from the walking paths to go unnoticed. and just beyond the reach of the first search efforts in 2004. Then they found the locket. It had been buried between the bodies, half swallowed by roots, a silver heart tarnished and rusted along the hinge. Inside was a small black and white photo, still visible through the corrosion. A woman with dark hair cradling a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. Forensic archivists later confirmed it was Lana and Jacob. The photo had been taken in a maternity ward the day after Jacob's birth. A copy had hung on Lana's refrigerator. The original had been missing since the night they disappeared. It wasn't just a burial, it was personal. The discovery unraveled investigators. Not because the remains were found, but because they had been so close all along. Less than half a mile from the car, less than 100 yards from the bridge the dogs had tracked toward. All those years ago, they had stood near this very spot. If they had dug just a little further, if the dogs hadn't lost the scent, none of this would have stayed buried. There were no signs of trauma on the bones that could confirm cause of death. The child's remains were too incomplete, but they did find marks on the cloth remnants near the wrist area. 2 indentations, parallel. Possible restraints. Lana's jaw had fractured at the joint, post-mortem, or possibly during the act of disposal. There were no gunshot wounds, no blade impressions, but it was clear to investigators. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural. This was concealment. And it worked. For weeks, the site was treated like an open crime scene. Forensics scanned the area for additional remains, clothing, fibers. They found nothing further of significance, but the implications were devastating. Whoever had done this had knowledge of the terrain. They knew where the water line stopped, where the runoff would protect the soil. They didn't just leave Lana and Jacob there by chance. They chose that spot, which meant it was someone who knew the bridge, knew the habits of search crews, someone local. When news broke officially, the town reacted the way towns like Wren's Hollow always do, quietly, with stares, with whispers, with questions too hard to ask out loud. Lana's remaining family held a vigil, placing sunflowers near the creek bed. Someone left a juice box on the edge of the soil. Another left a crayon. There were no speeches, no press conferences, just people standing in the heat, not speaking, finally knowing, and finally not wondering. For detectives, the discovery brought both relief and a resurgence of urgency. They had physical proof now. They had a crime. But they didn't have a killer. No DNA had surfaced yet. No fingerprints. No discarded tools. Just the bodies. Just the location. Just the decision to keep them near, but hidden. And as investigators began re-examining the list of people who had access to the area in 2004, one reality became impossible to ignore. The person who did this didn't leave town. They didn't vanish. They stayed. I worked. I walked the same roads, passed the same flyers, drove by the same creek for 21 years without ever once looking over their shoulder, because they didn't need to. They had buried the truth in shallow silt, and it had held until now. After the remains were confirmed and the burial site mapped, investigators turned their attention to the question that had loomed for 2 decades. Who would have known how to place them there so precisely? Not just in terms of location, but timing, terrain, and how to avoid detection. The silt buildup, the tree cover, the natural runoff channels, it all pointed to someone familiar with the creek. Someone who didn't just stumble across the spot, but had worked around it, possibly for years. That's when they began combing through old infrastructure logs, county maintenance files, bridge inspections, crew assignments. And that's when a name emerged from the paperwork: Darren Lyle. At first glance, he looked like background noise, a county employee. Maintenance foreman, no criminal record, no public accusations. But the deeper they dug, the more the pieces shifted. Darren had worked the Bellman Creek route in 2004. In fact, he had personally signed off on 2 routine inspections that October, one just 4 days before Lana and Jacob vanished. He wasn't just in the area. He had access to it when no one else did. The second bridge crew member on the roster from that month had passed away in 2013, a heart attack in his sleep. That left Darren as the only living man with an official reason to be on or around that exact stretch of road during the window of the disappearance. And what stood out more than the paper trail was how little anyone in town really knew him. He'd worked for the county for nearly 30 years, never married, no children, no social media. Lived in a one-bedroom trailer behind a bait shop for most of the early 2000s. Neighbors described him as quiet, odd, kept to himself, kept his lights off. No one recalled ever being inside his home. He often walked alone along the wooded trails near the bridge, even when he wasn't on duty. Sometimes he would sit for hours near the turnoff to Bramble Road, parked, unmoving. Then, an old report surfaced, dated October 14, 2004. The night Lana and Jacob vanished. A handwritten note from a gas station clerk described a man in a brown truck parked for nearly 40 minutes along the east wall, watching the pumps. The clerk said he didn't seem drunk or aggressive, just still, watching. The note was filed, but without a license plate or full name, it went nowhere. Until now. Investigators tracked down records of county vehicle assignments. In 2004, Darren had access to a tan Ford F-150 assigned to rural bridge inspections. The truck was decommissioned in early 2005 and sold to a scrapyard just outside of Miller's Crossing. That truck had never been processed for evidence. It had disappeared into metal before anyone thought to look. They reached out to the scrap company, but the vehicle was long gone, stripped, crushed, recycled. But the timing raised red flags. Darren had scrapped his county-issued vehicle just 5 months after the disappearance, without an official damage report or incident log. And that wasn't the only discrepancy. A retired dispatcher recalled a call placed by Darren in the fall of 2004. He'd asked for nighttime access to the Bramble sector, citing flood damage concerns. No report was filed afterward, no photos submitted, just a name, a date, and an open gate key recorded in the county sign-out log. The location was just 0.2 of a mile from where Lana's car had been found. Detectives brought Darren in for questioning in late July 2025. Now in his late 60s, his hair was gray, his face weathered. He still worked part-time doing off-the-books repair work for an independent road contractor. When asked about his truck, he claimed he couldn't remember, said it had electrical problems. When asked about Lana Merritt, he said the name didn't ring a bell. When asked if he had ever been near Bellman Creek in October 2004, he hesitated, then answered that he'd been everywhere in the county at some point or another. His responses weren't combative, but they weren't cooperative either. A search warrant was issued for his home, but by then, Darren had moved to a smaller unit outside of town. Most of his belongings had been downsized or discarded. Inside the trailer, investigators found maps, hundreds of them, topographical prints, county blueprints, elevation models. Many were marked in pen. One, folded behind a filing cabinet, showed a route from Bramble Road to the base of Bellman Creek Bridge. The location of the burial site was marked with a faint X. It wasn't enough. Not yet. No DNA, no photos, no confession. But for the first time since the case began, investigators were looking at someone who didn't just fit the geography, but the behavior, the timing, and the quiet. Someone who knew the bridge. Knew when no one would be watching, and knew how to disappear in his own hometown for 21 years without ever leaving. And the most unsettling part was this. If Darren had placed the bodies there, it meant he was watching the town's grief unfold the entire time, watching the vigils, the posters, the interviews, watching search teams come within feet of the truth and walk away, watching the bridge rot while the bodies stayed right where he left them, silent and unseen. The search warrant was executed at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday. Officers arrived quietly at Darren Lyle's modest property just outside Miller's Crossing, a low-set ranch home tucked behind a line of cedar trees, overgrown and half-forgotten. He answered the door in sweatpants, holding a coffee cup, and didn't argue. Deputies entered with gloves on and heads down, methodical. They started with the house, cataloging notebooks, maps, tools. Most of it was benign. Loner clutter, newspaper stacks, diagrams of old bridge supports. But it was the detached garage, hidden behind a collapsing fence, that brought everything to a stop. The garage looked abandoned at first glance, broken light above the door, paint flaking off. But inside, behind a false panel in the far wall, they found a crawl space sealed with 3 metal latches. Once opened, the air shifted. It smelled like mold and insulation, stale sweat and dust. The walls were covered in cheap soundproofing foam, the kind used in recording booths. The floor was bare plywood. There were no windows, no light fixture. Just a pile of decayed fabric in the corner, scattered debris, and what looked like a broken bracelet wedged into the floor seam. Forensics swept the room carefully. Blacklight revealed faint smudges, finger marks, boot scuffs, stains that had bled into the wood over time. The bracelet had plastic beads, blue and yellow, spelling out the name Jacob in faded letters. DNA swabs confirmed it belonged to Jacob Merritt. In the corner, beneath a layer of dust and rodent droppings, they found strands of hair, tangled in a screw hook fixed to the wall. The lab would later confirm it was a match to Lana. They didn't wait for more. Darren was taken into custody without incident. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for his phone. When placed in the interrogation room, he sat quietly, hands folded, eyes unfocused. The detectives asked if he knew why he was there. He nodded once, then waited. It didn't take long for him to speak. He said he'd been watching them for weeks, Lana and her son. Said he used to see them at the gas station when they stopped after preschool. Said he didn't have a plan at first, that it just became a thought. He admitted to staging a flat tire trap on Bramble Road, placing nails in a slow arc across the shoulder. Claimed he waited in the woods after dark until he saw her pull over. Then he approached, said she didn't scream. Just asked if he had a jack. When asked what happened next, his answers turned vague. He said the boy cried, said he didn't like that, said the crying stayed in his head too long. He didn't describe what he did, didn't say how long he kept them, just that it didn't take long. When detectives pressed him for detail, for how, for when, for why, he only stared at the table, then said flatly, "She liked the water," said it helped him sleep. The detectives didn't believe him, not the phrasing, not the tone, but it didn't matter. They had enough. The bracelet, the hair, the confession. A judge signed the first-degree murder charges that afternoon. The town reacted the way Wren's Hollow always had, with restraint, with fear, with silence. People who remembered Darren from bridge work said he always seemed harmless, said he helped sandbag floods back in '97, said he used to fix mailboxes when no one asked. But none of them had ever been in his garage. None of them had ever seen that crawl space. None of them had known what sat just beneath the floorboards of his life for 2 decades. Rachel Kiernan, whose father had first mentioned the bridge years ago, watched the news unfold from Calverton. She told reporters she didn't feel relief, just something colder, like breathing air that had been sealed off for too long. Lana's sister released a statement but didn't speak to the press. There would be a funeral, she said, but no public service. She didn't want faces there who hadn't searched when it mattered. The crawl space was dismantled piece by piece, catalogued and stored. The rest of the house was emptied and condemned. But officers who entered that room said the stillness inside stayed with them. Because nothing about it felt random, the soundproofing, the hook, the way the bracelet had snapped in half, it had been deliberate, controlled, quiet, just like Darren. Just like the 20 years that passed without anyone noticing. And yet, the question still lingered. Why bury them beneath the bridge? Why keep them so close to where they were last seen? And why now, after all these years, confess? When asked once more in a final interview, Darren gave a half smile, barely noticeable, and said, "No one ever looked under." Then he looked away and said nothing else. In the spring of 2026, Darren Lyle stood before a jury of 9 women and 3 men and showed no expression. The trial was brief, evidence was overwhelming. His confession, his proximity to the burial site, the DNA-confirmed bracelet, and the hair recovered from his hidden crawlspace told a story no defense attorney could undo. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. He did not flinch when it was read aloud. He nodded once and asked if he could go now. He said nothing to the Merritt family, nothing about why. Not to the court, not to the press, not even to his own legal team. In the days that followed, Wren's Hollow didn't celebrate. There was no closure, only a final official answer. and for some, even that felt like a half-truth. They had known the man for years. He fixed potholes, salted roads in the winter, waved quietly at passers-by without a hint of darkness in his face. The idea that he had walked among them for 2 decades, with full knowledge of what he'd done, with the bodies hidden so close to their homes, had eroded whatever comfort justice was supposed to bring. The resolution didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something had only just begun. The bridge was torn down that summer. A safety measure, according to county officials. Structural damage. Risk of collapse. But people in town believed it was more than that they needed it gone. Too many memories, too much weight. When the demolition crews arrived, a handful of locals stood at a distance, watching the beams fall. Some left flowers on the edge of the creek before the backhoes moved in. No one spoke. Rachel Kiernan left town shortly after the sentencing. She packed her father's journals, the mold-stained drawings, and the old lunchbox she'd found in his shed, and didn't tell anyone where she was headed. Her role in the discovery had never been publicized beyond her name, but people knew. And in a town that rarely forgave the past, she didn't want to find out what it meant to be the one who unlocked it. The Merritt family held a joint memorial on the 21st anniversary of the disappearance. The graves were set side by side in Wren's Hollow Cemetery, beneath a single stone etched with both names. The photo inside the recovered locket was reprinted, framed, and placed beside the flowers. No cameras, no reporters, just those who had stayed. A handful of friends, Lana's sister, an old teacher of Jacob's who never erased his name from the birthday list. That night, long-haul drivers traveling Route 16 began reporting strange sounds near the creek where the bridge used to be. At first, it was dismissed as wind or wildlife, but the stories were consistent. Whispers, soft crying, a voice too small to be heard clearly. Some said they saw figures near the old crossing, no lights, no motion, just silhouettes. Others reported hearing something heavier in the stillness, like footsteps pacing beneath the earth. No one ever found anything when they stopped, but most chose not to stop at all. They kept their windows rolled up, eyes straight ahead, lights on. Law enforcement chalked it up to local legend, the kind of thing that always clings to a place touched by something like this. But officers who had worked the case from the beginning, those who remembered the fog, the quiet, the open car door, the drawings in the dirt, admitted quietly that they avoided the area too. The case file was closed officially in August, all evidence stored, cataloged, and sealed in climate-controlled archive boxes under a final case number. But one detective kept a copy of the original site sketch, the one drawn by the officer who first arrived at the car in 2004. In the margins, someone had written, "Car facing east, the doors open, headlights still on." That note had stuck with him for 21 years. He never forgot it, because it suggested she had stopped voluntarily. Maybe she hadn't seen what was coming until it was too late. Now, with Darren Lyle behind bars and the bridge erased from the map, the town of Wren's Hollow tells the story differently. They don't talk about how Lana died. They talk about how long she was left there. How close she had been, how many people passed over that creek, unaware, and how someone, for reasons they never fully explained, decided to bury a mother and her son just beneath where the world would keep walking. And even now, with nothing left standing but a patch of flattened weeds and rusted rebar, some say the bridge still groans at night, that it's not the wind, that it's not the trees, that it's something else entirely. Something older, something heavier, still moving beneath the surface, still waiting to be heard.